Thank you, Thomas, and thank you all for this very nice and very enlightening roundtable. It shows clearly that emotions are key, and besides systemic changes, and we do need systemic changes, inner transformation is a prerequisite for collectively achieving great and sustainable goals. Well, this is a topic that we will cover as well in our Sustainability Academy. I think you started to hear that the IMS has launched its Sustainability Academy, and this is a subject that will be covered, so you can have a look. Thank you, Glenn, as well. Glenn, for this highly constructive vision of a future, of a world of possibilities where humans live in symbiosis with their environment. Now, let's look at this anxiety from another perspective, because not everyone reacts in the same way when it comes to environmental questions, and some are still in denial, some are still even believing in conspiracy theories. The battle of opinion is still raging, actually, and especially on the web, leading to a polarization of opinions. So we are going now to hear from a leading expert on social network, on conspiracy theories, and more generally on the post-truth world, Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. The floor is yours.
Sit or stand. Well, thank you. My slides should be here somewhere, I think. There they are. Okay. Well, it's terrific to be here. And what I want to do today is talk about science and emotion and reasoning against the background of the so-called post-truth world that a lot of people are talking about. And just to set the stage, you may remember this person who was President of the United States for 4 years and managed to make more than 30,000 false or misleading claims during his time in office, with no apparent harm to his approval rating, as you can see in these data there, that were totally flat, unaffected by his misleading statements. Moreover, 3/4 of Republicans throughout his presidency considered him to be honest. Donald Trump is thought to be honest by his own partisans. How can that be? Now, this is fascinating because if you look at the type of stuff that Donald Trump or his press secretary were making claims about, like the largest audience ever to witness an inauguration, well, look at the photos. No, that wasn't the case. Far fewer people attended Donald Trump's inauguration than Obama's. Photos taken at the same time, on the same day, for the same occasion. There's absolutely no ambiguity here about what is right and what is wrong if you just look at the photos. But weirdly, Donald Trump doesn't want you to do that. He wants to say, oh, whatever you're seeing is not what you're seeing, what you're reading is not what you're reading. Just listen to me. I can tell you what the truth is. And this whole theme of replacing obvious evidence, obvious truths with something else, something much more intuitive and emotional, that theme is running throughout the post-truth world that we're currently experiencing. And there's all this talk about something other than evidence out there. Now, this has been called shock and chaos disinformation, and it refers to a situation where a lot of the lies that politicians of that stripe are disseminating, they often have no apparent purpose, or they can be entirely incoherent. For example, after the downing of the Malaysian airliner, Russia, which was responsible for it, they initially claimed it was a Ukrainian attack. Then they said the pilot crashed the plane, which is completely incoherent. But so what? They were just generating a blizzard of disinformation. And whenever anybody wants to challenge this, those challenges can be relabeled as fake news. Donald Trump considers anything fake news that is correcting his statements. And one consequence of the shock and chaos disinformation is that people's notion of truth itself, the fancy word is ontology, all it means is what is truth like? Our understanding of that itself changes. And it changes because in populism, the idea of truth has been rebranded in a particular way. Or what's populism? Well, most of you have an intuitive understanding of what it is. It is basically a very thin ideology that does nothing other than to take a society and divide it into, on the one hand, the people, and on the other hand, the elite. And the people are always right, and the elite is always corrupt and wrong. And that dividing line is placed wherever it is convenient for a populist politician. And it's entirely artificial, this division. And it is anti-democratic because it negates the plurality of opinion that characterizes a democracy. And one of the consequences of this division between people and the elites is that common sense is seen to be truth by default. And whatever evidence the elites, such as scientists, mainstream media, doctors, all that evidence that they produce is denigrated because it is coming from the so-called elite. So what happens then is that truth-seeking as a shared goal of society is cast aside. And what replaces it is this sense, this intuitive, emotional sense of authenticity. And here is a fantastic paper by a colleague of mine published a few years ago that analyzes this notion of authenticity and how it relates to Donald Trump and others of his caliber. One of the really interesting things, I already mentioned that, about Donald Trump is that he says things that are so clearly false that you wonder why he would even bother. Well, the answer is, in so doing, he is sending a signal. He's sending a signal of contempt for an establishment norm of truth-telling. Things like truth-telling, education, evidence, truth-seeking, all of that are norms in our societies that were designed by the elites. So if you're a populist politician, you oppose these elites, you want to signal that opposition to your followers, what better thing can you do other than to lie all the time? That is a clear signal that you're authentically opposing the elites. Now, this doesn't always work. Populist politicians are not always successful. They are successful only under certain conditions. And these conditions are that people feel left out, feel threatened, feel left behind, and they then latch on to a leader who appears to be speaking out authentically on their behalf. Where might that come from? This populism and the attractiveness of people who lie. Well, there's a lot of answers to that question, and it's not totally clear, and I only have about 20 seconds to give you one answer. But let me try to give you at least a partial answer. And it involves this graph here, which has two lines that both go up during the post-war period. These are American data, and what it means is that over time, productivity went up. Productivity is just the output that a given worker in the economy produces. One of those lines, I forget which, doesn't matter, they're on top of each other. One of them is productivity, and the other one is the wage that the workers get paid. Now, this is Economics 101. As productivity goes up, workers make more money. So they should, because they're producing more. Well, the graph ends at 1979 or 1980, because that's when things changed. And since then, since about 1980, productivity has continued to increase. Our workers and the economy generally is more and more productive. There hasn't been a decline in productivity increases. But wages have fallen behind. And the difference between these two graphs now is $1 squintillion that are not in the pockets of workers. They know that. Of course they can sense that. At the moment they can sense that and they feel left behind, that is when populism becomes attractive. Now, what does that have to do with science? Climate science in particular? Well, it turns out a lot. Because however understandable it is that people might feel left behind, there is this antithetical relationship between populism and science, for pretty much the reasons I've already given you. The idea behind populism is one of emotion, of feeling authentic. It is not about scientific evidence and truth-seeking. And so it's not surprising that in lots of different indicators, we can find a pattern that is relating populism to declining acceptance of science. These are data from before the pandemic that is plotting the amount of vaccine skepticism in a country, in Europe, against the vote share of populist parties. And without pointing the blame or a finger at particular countries, you can see there's a very strong relationship. The more populism has a hold in a country, the more people are vaccine skeptical, or they were before the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, has changed everything, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, that was vaccinations, but the same is true for climate change. If you look at survey data and people's attitudes towards climate change, a really strong predictor is populism. There's a Swedish sample, one study there. There's another one in the UK. Doesn't matter where you look, what countries you consider. It is the ideology of populism that predicts whether or not people accept climate change. But it's not just populism. It is also, in this case, more generally, a cluster of right-wing conservative worldviews. Now, I'm saying this without any blame or without pointing a finger at anybody in particular, but regardless of how you measure it, whether it's party affiliation in the United States or other instruments, whether you call it conservatism or libertarianism, you always find that the more people endorse things such as free markets, the less likely they are to accept climate change. And I put up that graph there as an illustration of the strength of that relationship. In social sciences, data that are that strong are rare, and this has replicated countless times. And we all know that because it is, of course, conservative politicians that tend to oppose climate mitigation for very understandable reasons, because it requires interference in the economy in the way we do business now. And for some people, that is extremely challenging. And that variable trumps everything else. And this is important to understand. What I'm showing you in both of these graphs here are various different data sets by a colleague of mine, Larry Hamilton. In all cases, you will see one line or a bunch of lines that goes up. They're the Democrats or liberals who become more and more concerned about global warming the more educated they are or the more they understand it. And then you'll see another pattern of lines or a single line that goes down. And they're the Republicans or conservatives. The more educated they are, the more they know about climate change, the less concerned they are. So we have this ironic situation where more information or more education can make things worse. By worse, in this case, I mean increased polarization. How can that happen? Well, basically, the more educated you are, the smarter you are, the more skillful you are to invent reasons for your economic views to be protected against this pesky evidence from climate science. People are better able to rationalize what they really want to believe. Now, this role of ideology or worldviews has what I call downstream consequences. And we see it with COVID, we see it with climate change, we see it pretty much everywhere whenever science clashes with people's deeply held ideological beliefs. And that downstream consequence is conspiracy theories. Because if all the scientists agree on climate change, surely they have to be out to create the world government. It has to be a conspiracy. And indeed, if you look at the data, and the numbers here are not terribly important, what is important is the fact that there's a minus sign in front of every single number, which means that the more people endorse conspiracy theories, the less likely they are to endorse vaccinations, to accept that smoking causes lung cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Even for nanotechnology, that pattern holds, which is really interesting because no one knows what nanotechnology is. But if you ask people about it, then it turns out that the more they believe in conspiracy theories, the less likely they're going to accept that there's anything positive about nanotechnologies. And this is where we now enter emotion big time, because one of the major drivers of conspiracy theories and people's belief in those theories is emotion. It is the perceived loss of control. It is fear and uncertainty. Now, what better way to induce fear or uncertainty or a loss of control than to have a nice little pandemic? And that is precisely what happened during the pandemic. Not just this pandemic, but any other pandemic we know of previously. It causes or leads to conspiracy theories because people are frightened. People have lost control. And so what do? They seek comfort in a theory that says, oh yeah, this is all bad stuff, but you know what? It's Bill Gates who did it. And for some people, that offers comfort because being able to blame somebody is chicken soup for the soul. Makes you feel, okay, well, if he weren't that bad, the world would be different. And that is easier to accept for some people than just randomness. A random bat coughing on a guy in a Chinese cave transmitting this virus is much harder to accept than Bill Gates somehow being involved in this, or Al Gore, or George Soros. Any of these people have been blamed for conspiracies along the way. So, what can we do? It's not all doom and gloom. The data are pretty clear. Most people in most countries trust scientists. Trust in scientists in Europe has gone up dramatically during the pandemic. Certainly during the first year of the pandemic, went up by 20 or 30 percentage points in Germany and the UK. Most people are not populists. Depends on the country. There are some countries where that's not true. But for the most part, most people are not populists, and they get their news from trustworthy sources. Especially during the pandemic, we've found that it's only about 15% of the people that latch onto Facebook and go down the rabbit hole. So what can we do in light of this? How can we build on that? Well, there's a whole toolbox of things, and I've tried in my research to contribute to that, and we've published a bunch of public-facing handbooks, one about conspiracy theories, the other one about debunking. Don't worry about the links. I'll put up a QR code at the end where you can access them all. These are available in multiple different languages and provide a lot of hands-on advice on how you might deal with people who believe in conspiracy theories or who are opposing science. Now, I can't go through the whole toolbox, but I can talk about one thing just to illustrate the type of thing we can do. And I want to illustrate that in the context of oysters and then climate change. The question I want to ask is, would you eat these oysters? Now, here's the information that comes with that. The information is that 97 out of 100 microbiologists recommend against eating these because they're contaminated. 2 out of 100 are unsure, and 1 says it's okay. Go ahead. Now, what would you do? I don't know about you, but eat them. Yeah, somebody always wants to eat them. I love oysters, but in this case, actually, no, I would not eat the oysters, and neither would most of you. Now, the number 97 out of 100 is not arbitrary because we know from a number of research studies that the scientific consensus on climate change, namely that the climate is changing, that humans are causing it, and that it's a problem, we know that the agreement on that in the literature, the scientific literature, and among scientists is in excess of 97%. In fact, by now, I think the agreement has become even stronger. Well, what can we do with that information? Well, it turns out that we can use that information in itself about the scientific consensus as a communication tool. We can tell people about the scientific consensus, which very often increases acceptance of the science. It's not a magic wand, it doesn't always work, but in most circumstances it works. And it works in particular among conservatives who might otherwise be inclined to dismiss climate change. And just to illustrate the latter point, here's a little graph from one of my studies where we have a control group in red, a consensus group in green, and it is measuring acceptance of climate change, and the consensus group accepts climate change more, and it does so disproportionately more for people who are strong believers in free markets who would normally not be as inclined to accept climate change. And yes, yet again, we have a handbook about the tool of consensus communication, which brings me now nicely to my conclusions and the take-home messages. There are threats, no question. The post-truth world presents challenges. And if there's one take-home message that's, to my mind, really important, it is that attitudes towards climate change arise out of deeply held political and ideological beliefs. And that we have to take that seriously, and we have to understand that when we talk to people. And conspiracy theories are an occasional downstream consequence of that, and they can be toxic, and especially when amplified by fear and uncertainty. But all of that we can understand, and we can have a conversation about it, and we can think of interventions to counter populism. And we have to remember that most people actually trust scientists and vaccinations, and they trust us on climate change as well. And as I promised, here are my resources. They exist in up to 16 different languages. I put up German because I thought in Luxembourg, most of you probably speak German. And if you point your phone at that QR code, you should be able to download them if you're interested. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. It's okay. Thank you very much, Professor Lewandowsky. It It was super interesting. Un grand merci en effet pour cet éclairage qui nous montre en fait qu'il existe encore des stratégies d'évitement face aux mauvaises nouvelles environnementales et qu'il y a cette fameuse polarisation grandissante, nourrie par la peur, donc par les émotions, qui opposent les uns aux autres à l'heure où il faudrait au contraire agir de concert et avec célérité face à l'urgence climatique. Alors le combat, il est certes sur le terrain des solutions, donc ça, IMS travaille beaucoup dessus, sur justement ces solutions et leur mise en
IMS is working a lot on solutions, but we also need to remind that it's a fight for the minds as well. We need to change beliefs, as we have just seen now. It's tempting to give in, but the battle for beliefs needs to be fought for a long time still. There is a movement in the corporate world. We'll have some concrete examples reinventing capitalism. Some companies will come and be witnesses in front of their stakeholders. We are happy to welcome John Elkington, who will be here in a few moments. See you soon.